Welcome to the Christmas season. Let's talk about aliens. It's Christmas season. This is the Christmas show, and we are offering a Christmas deal out of the grand joy and munificence of my heart in the spirit of the season. You can go to youngheretics.com/shop and get 20% off all of our merch when you use the code Santa. You know our merch. It's the best in the biz. It's high quality. We test it all ourselves. I love wearing my Young Heretics shirt around, especially the one that says "We're reading Homer and screw you." And you can get all of this, plus it makes a great Christmas gift, so you can get it for other people too, when you go to youngheretics.com/shop and use the code Santa. I immediately morph into a vast, ghastly combination of Ebenezer Scrooge and the Grinch on December 26th. So this deal will end on Christmas. After Christmas, there's no more 20% off. So go now to youngheretics.com/shop and enter the code Santa to get 20% off. Happy Advent. It is Advent, the season of the lead up to Christmas. People typically confuse this with the Christmas season, which extends for many days after December the 25th. But right now we are contemplating the incarnation and expecting it, awaiting it in the liturgical calendar. And last year when this time came up, I did a special Christmas episode. This year I want to do something a little bit different, and I'd like to do 3 episodes on the trilogy that is sometimes called the Space Trilogy, sometimes called the Ransom Trilogy. It's C.S. Lewis's grand space sci-fi allegory for the Christian universe. He sometimes calls it a fairy tale for grown-ups, and I just think it is his literary masterwork, especially the third one. The 3 books are called Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength. A lot of you have asked for episodes on this, and the Christmas season seems like as good a time as any to get down to them, especially because one of the things I said last year when we talked about Christmas was that the familiarity of the Christmas story sometimes prevents us from seeing it in its full strangeness and complexity and miraculousness, and for delving into the significance of what it means. Even if you are not coming to this as a committed Christian, you can acknowledge that it's a foundational text in the West and come to understand its significance that way as well. Because we've heard these stories over and over again, even for not Christians, we sometimes, hear the Bible verses recited or, parts of it sung in Christmas music and all that great 1950s kind of songbook stuff. Because of that, we sometimes need to look at it from a kind of oblique angle and come at these themes another way. I think that's what Lewis is essentially doing in this trilogy. There are, of course, there's a kind of Christianity that would accuse him of some sort of idolatry or heresy for, making these fantasy stories up. But he's actually participating in a very old Christian tradition of telling stories about the outer world that aren't necessarily meant to be literally true so much as meant to be depictions, mimesis, if you will. We've been talking a lot about this, right? These kind of allegorical, metaphorical depictions of the world that the Christian theology depicts and how the world really is in a kind of new myth. When we talk about art all the time about how myth and story can get closer to the heart of things, closer to what things are like than just literal description of stuff. If I say, I fell in love, it's very different than saying, my heart caught in my chest and it was as if I was chasing a deer through the woods, right? This is one classic allegory for love. And these stories, these space trilogy stories, I think, some of the early books have some problems. They can get a little clunky sometimes, kind of long descriptions. The essence of them is that what Lewis told in his nonfiction, in his speeches and essays and nonfiction books, he shows in these novels. It's kind of like the same theme in a different mode or transposed into a different key. What I want to do when I read these books to you is not just summarize the plot, because I always get a little antsy when we do novels. I don't want to spoil stuff. It really bugs me. I don't know if it bugs you, but when you get a classic novel, like say Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, we talked about a while back, you read the back cover and it tells you everything. It just assumes the classic novel everybody knows. But, if everybody has to read a novel the first time sometime, and if you're coming to a novel for the first time, one of the chief pleasures is finding out what happens. So I don't want to spoil all the plot points of these books for you, but I do want to read some key passages from them, some of the, I think, the most beautiful scenes and provocative scenes from them, and then set them against passages from Lewis's own nonfiction and from some of the deeper, older sources that he was always drawing on. This is one of the things I love most about C.S. Lewis, is that he had this vast learning, and he never beat you over the head with it, but it's always there beneath the surface, like the iceberg, right? The tip of the iceberg is what you see, but then there's this enormous kind of mass underneath it. And that's how, writers and scholars like Aristotle and Milton work a lot of the time in Lewis. They're kind of just beneath the surface. So I'm going to try to explain and show how some of these deep classical ideas, especially ideas about the incarnation, about what it means that God took on flesh. I'm going to try to show how those come to be in allegorical form and a form you can feel in these new stories. So let's get into it. One of the great joys of this show is that I get to go deep with you into the roots and ancient history of Western ideas and traditions. There's no better way to do that than to read ancient texts in their original languages, and that is why I love recommending the Ancient Language Institute to my listeners. Anybody that enjoys this show can benefit enormously from learning Latin, Greek, or Biblical Hebrew. ALI, the Ancient Language Institute, teaches them all, and they teach them in a way that immediately unlocks these literary treasures for their students. It's not something that you have to have a PhD to do. It's not something that you have to be a language expert in. They don't even really bug you with a bunch of the sort of preliminaries before they get you right down to reading. You don't have to puzzle through all this arcane grammar and stuff. They'll put you right in the deep end with people like Aristotle, Virgil, and Cicero. You'll be amazed at how quickly you get this kind of face-to-face encounter with these great authors and their wisdom. To do this, you just go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics. That's ancientlanguage.com/heretics, and you'll get a 10% discount on tuition with the promo code heretics, HERETICS. You can read the Bible in its original languages, the great Athenian philosophers, the golden age of poetry of Rome, and more. ancientlanguage.com/heretics, promo code heretics. You'll love it. Check it out. So you probably remember that we've met Lewis before on this show. I rate him very, very highly. I value his works enormously, and I think even though he's beloved, some of his scholarship is actually quite underrated. We know that this is a man who went to Oxford, that he interrupted his undergraduate education by fighting. He fought in World War I, was wounded there, and tried to fight in World War II, but was prohibited on account of certain health infirmities, and so instead, basically saved the soul of England on the home front, stayed home, and wrote some of his best work during the war. These novels were published throughout the period of the Second World War and just after. Out of the Silent Planet comes out in 1938. That Hideous Strength in 1945. So we're dealing with the period of the Second World War and of the immediate aftermath. The main character, the hero, Elwyn Ransom, he's a philologist. That is to say that he's, generally speaking, a lover or a scholar of logos, of language. But typically that word generally refers to a classicist, somebody who studies what I study, ancient Greece and Rome, or other ancient texts like Sanskrit work and stuff. So he's a philologist like me and like Lewis. Ransom has been wounded. He's been on the Somme, so the Battle of the Somme in World War I, and does not fight in World War II because he's off exploring intergalactic planets. So you can kind of get at what I'm saying here. Lewis's friend, J.R.R. Tolkien of the Lord of the Rings trilogy fame, said, you shouldn't think that Ransom is akin to anybody in the real world, but I think he kind of protests too much. I think this is Lewis sort of working out some of his own ideas in dramatic mythical form, much as, for example, Dante in his Paradiso, the great Italian epic poet of the Christian world, imagined the heavens and the cosmos as literally full of angels and blessed souls and God, right? This is a similar tradition. Lewis engages with it elsewhere as well. In his Great Divorce, he writes, imaginary stories about what it would be like to go to hell and heaven. And this is the same kind of thing in which a character that looks a lot like Lewis, a lot like his friends, such as Tolkien, exists. But Lewis also kind of represents himself as a character, as a friend of Ransom's who hears and reports about all of these journeys. So that's how the whole thing works. We begin with Ransom on a walking tour. He is taking this, vacation. In Oxford and Cambridge, they have these vast breaks, which I remember with great fondness, that you would take, lots and lots of weeks off. And the Dawn's, Ransom is from Cambridge, so the Cambridge Dawn can kind of just wander and disappear. And he ends up, through various intrigues, ensnared, entangled in this plot of a scientist named Weston and his accomplice named Divine. They drug him. They've been intending, it seems, to use this poor boy for this project, but they instead use Ransom. They drug him. They figure nobody will miss him because he's a Dawn out in the middle of nowhere. He's unmarried, and they send him into space. He stumbles upon the fact that there's a plot going on to make interplanetary travel. So the first thing that I'm going to read to you is from this passage where Ransom wakes up and gets his bearings and realizes that he's on a spaceship flying to what's going to turn out to be Mars. All of the planets have their own sort of magical names in this trilogy that are in Old Solar, which is the language that's spoken in outer space, in the cosmos. And so Mars is called Malacandra, but he's headed to Malacandra, or to Mars, with his two rather shifty companions, Weston and Divine. Here's the passage. I'm reading from this lovely little bound volume of all three space trilogy books. I shouldn't call it little because it's actually kind of massive. It's a compilation of the three put out by HarperCollins Publishers. And here's the first passage that I want to read to you. This is Ransom's journey into space. Ransom, as time wore on, became aware of another and more spiritual cause for his progressive lightening and exaltation of heart, a nightmare long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science, was falling off him. He had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness, which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it affected him till now that the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from it every moment. How indeed should it be otherwise, since out of this ocean the worlds and all their life had come? He had thought it barren. He now saw that it was the womb of worlds, whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly even upon the earth with so many eyes, and here with how many more. No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens which declared the glory, the happy climes that lie where day never shuts his eye, up in the broad fields of the sky. He quoted Milton's words to himself lovingly at this time and often. I'm going to get to the Milton of it all in just a second, but first I want to point out to you that this is one of the governing themes of the trilogy, and it's contained in that phrase, the mythology of science, or the mythology, rather, that follows on science. And we've talked about this before because, we've had occasion to discuss coronavirus a lot on this podcast, and sometimes, I think we can get it twisted because the word science has been so terribly misused and mishandled. Fauci recently came out. Dr. Fauci said, I represent science. He's as if he is this magical entity called science. And when we react so negatively to that, it's not because we hate the idea of studying the natural world, just the opposite. It's a perfectly honorable and valuable thing to do. It's a venerable thing. In ancient terms, this is called physical philosophy or natural philosophy. The Greek word physike means that which is natural, and that's where we get our word physics. And as our buddy Aristotle reminds us, it is that which has its principle of change and being at rest within itself. So that which has physis, it's literally a metaphor of plants that grow, right? They grow of their own accord. Everything that happens spontaneously, just because of how things are, that's physis, that's physics, that's natural science. Now, things that happen spontaneously happen according to rules. Spontaneously, when I hold a rock in my hand and let it go, it falls to the earth. Why? Because it is in the nature of masses to attract one another by the force of gravity. It is the nature of this small mass to be attracted to the large mass of the earth and fall to the ground. That's what science is. As we use the term, we use it to describe what the ancients would have called natural philosophy, the study of the machine world, how things work according to rules and laws. Now, it used to be the case that there were other branches of philosophy too, and these included such things as politics and ethics, right? How to live in the world, how to use your free will to be moral and good, and importantly for our conversation here, metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is just a Greek prefix, meta, applied to physics, which remember means natural, things that happen spontaneously. So metaphysics, metaphysike, is that which is beyond the spontaneous, that which is more than mechanical, more than mere machine. And so metaphysics includes such things as the study or the contemplation of God. And if you believe in such things as truth and free will at all, you have to believe in such things as metaphysics, because there have to be some things that don't just occur according to the natural rules and laws. Yes, I can tell you that when I think certain thoughts, certain electrons light up and fire. But if that's all it is, then the fact that I'm also having the experience of thinking a thought is just an accidental byproduct of this machine that is rolling on, in which case nothing that we say or talk about or think about matters. Love is an illusion. Chastity is an illusion. Fear, desire, memory, all an illusion. Metaphysics is the realm of all those things, the things that are beyond the mere mechanical, physical world. Many of our modern philosophers are materialists, which means essentially that they don't believe there is such a thing as metaphysics. And so all the questions that used to be answered by metaphysical philosophers or priests, these grand questions of man's purpose, his place in the universe, all of those questions have now been relegated to natural scientists. And that's why you hear natural scientists acting like priests, because they believe that the world which their science describes, the narrow physical world of mechanical motion, that world they think is everything. And so they think they have authority to pronounce on how we should live our lives politically, on how we should be moral, on what's good, right? And all of those things they think are contained within their physical science, which is, of course, in reality, just one tiny branch, an honorable and noble branch, but one tiny branch of this vast tree called philosophy. And so Lewis basically shows with this story that he's telling about the scientist and the religious dawn on a voyage through space, he shows that science comes with its own mythology, because when it appropriates all of this authority to itself, it naturally has to give answers to these big questions. What is man? What is man for? And we're going to get in a second to how bad Lewis thinks the answers that science gives to those questions are. But importantly, right, the mythology of science is invisible. We talk about space. We talk about evolution, and we tell these grand stories that have some sort of moral point to them. There's no morality in the physical world. There's just physics. There's just laws and events that occur, right? But we tell these stories as if there were consciousness in it all, as if there were purpose and meaning in story. But the story that we tell is of a vast, chaotic, empty universe, which behaves according to sort of mechanical laws that have no personality. And that mythology, Lewis is saying, is deadening to the soul. So he's trying to replace it with this new mythology, which tells the meaning of the physical realities that science rightly describes. Science should be the thing that tells us what happens in the physical world, but it's mythology and metaphysics and religion that tells us the meaning of it all, the significance, the metaphor, and of course, most importantly, our experience, our loves, our desires, our joys in it. And so he's trying to replace the mythology of science with his own mythology, and he's doing it by reference to this older idea that the heavens declare the glory of God, that they are the home of the blessed and the angels, even if our eyes are not equipped to see them in a physical sort of way, we still experience them in this metaphorical way. And so he quotes at this key moment, this tiny snatch, which you could easily miss and just read past, but it's a quote from Milton, another old pal of ours, author of, among other things, Paradise Lost, the great epic of man's fall, but also of this masque called comus. Now, masques are a kind of dead genre in some ways. It was a courtly genre, which is important for what we're going to get into in a second. But the courtly genre is, basically these different honorees or participants at a courtly festival will come and give gifts to their hosts, and they'll perform in costume with masks and recite these words that are written for them by poets. So Milton wrote this masque comus to be presented at Ludlow Castle in 1634. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that Milton was very skeptical of all the pomp and circumstance of earthly courts. He was a Puritan and wanted to return to sort of the natural, pure truths of the Christian faith. And so one of the things he does is he infuses this courtly ceremony with all its dances and its, rigmarole and etiquette. And he basically infuses it with deeper, richer significance of the heavens, right? That he depicts the heavens as themselves in this kind of courtly dance of obedience and respect to one another. So here's the conclusion, the end of this whole masque, which is where that quote from Lewis comes from. This is the end of of Comus by Milton. "To the ocean now I fly," says the spirit, "and those happy climes that lie where day never shuts his eye. Up in the broad fields of the sky, there I suck the liquid air, all amidst the gardens fair of Hesperus and his daughters three, that sing about the golden tree. Along the crisped shades and bowers revels the spruce and jocund spring. The graces and the rosy bosomed hours thither all their bounties bring, that there eternal summer dwells, and west winds with musky wing about the cedern alleys fling nard and cassia's balmy smells. Iris there with humid bough waters the odorous banks that blow flowers of more mingled hue than her purfled scarf can show, and drenches with Elysian dew. List mortals, if your ears be true. That's listen, mortals, if your ears be true. Beds of hyacinth and roses, where young Adonis oft reposes, waxing well of his deep wound, in slumber soft and on the ground. Sadly sits the Assyrian queen, but far above in spangled sheen, celestial Cupid, her famed son advanced, holds his dear Psyche sweet entranced, after her wandering labors long, till free consent the gods among make her his eternal bride, and from her fair unspotted side two blissful twins are to be born, youth and joy, so Jove hath sworn. Note that all of these allusions to classical mythology, right? Iris, Jove, Adonis. We're going to get in a second to the significance of this. But now my task, says the spirit, is smoothly done. I can fly or I can run quickly to the green earth's end, where the bowed welkin slow doth bend, and from thence can soar as soon to the corners of the moon. Mortals that would follow me, love virtue. She alone is free. She can teach ye how to climb higher than the sphery chime, or if virtue feeble were, heaven itself would stoop to her. Those last lines are very famous conclusion of the masque, which basically captures what Lewis is saying. Remember how we've talked about the tension in the Christian church between its deep indebtedness to pagan wisdom and antiquity and the sense that the Bible contains all truth in it, right? What do we do with all of these false myths and legends? And there are some who would say we should just reject them. But another strain, a strain of Augustine and even in some small senses Thomas Aquinas, another strain of Christian theology says that contained within these truths, within these myths, are half inklings of the truth. And once God, the Christian God, is set above them all, then they will be seen as embodiments of nature, which obeys God, that not only do the planets move in predictable ways, but those laws themselves that teach us how they move, the fact that we can understand these laws and see the order in the cosmos, that in itself is a declaration of the glory of God. It shows us a mind working behind all of this. Because, of course, there's no such thing as law without mind. What does it mean for there to be natural law, except for there to be a mind in which this law is proposed? And the very idea that we're learning the order of the heavens contains within it this sense that the heavens have an order. And so in Lewis, kind of by reference to Milton, the things that physics discovers become these kind of animate things that not that there actually are, if you can, go out there, you could touch and see like some kind of magical sprite dancing around. But that things like the motion of the planet Venus has a kind of character, an expressive character, in addition to its mere physical presence. And so he's trying to repopulate the world with these mythical characters as expressions of God's favor and his beneficence upon the universe, and as servants of God. All the old gods and all the old sprites become servants of God, and in Milton also of virtue, which leads humanity up into this heavenly sphere, even if we can't go there physically. It's an incredibly profound way of acknowledging the rightful sphere of science, while also imbuing science with a mythology that is more powerful, higher, deeper, and older than its own. Central to this vision of the heavens is the idea of what Lewis calls the hierarchical principle. And that's central also to this trilogy. So here's a conversation between Ransom and the Malacandrians, the occupants of Malacandra, which is Mars, right? There are three of them. There's the Seroni or the Sorn, who are the kind of philosophers and scientists of the race. There's the Hrossa, who are these kind of otter men that are the poets and the natives in some ways. They resemble natives. And then there are the Fifiltrigi, if that's how you say it, who are the kind of dwarf-like makers of things, the artisans. And he's with, at this point, Ransom is with the Seroni, and they're asking him about life on Earth. He says, the evening's conversation was not such as would interest a terrestrial reader, for the Sorns had determined that Ransom should not ask, but answer questions. Their questioning was very different from the rambling, imaginative inquiries of the Hrossa. They worked systematically from the geology of Earth to its present geography, and then in turn to flora, fauna, human history, languages, politics, and arts. When they found that Ransom could tell them no more on a given subject, and this happened pretty soon in most of their inquiries, they dropped it at once and went on to the next. Often they drew out of him indirectly much more knowledge than he consciously possessed, apparently working from a wide background of general science. A casual remark about trees when Ransom was trying to explain the manufacture of paper would fill up for them a gap in his sketchy answers to their botanical questions. His accounts of terrestrial navigation might illuminate mineralogy, and his description of the steam engine gave them a better knowledge of terrestrial air and water than Ransom ever had. He had decided from the outset that he would be quite frank, for he now felt that it would be not now, and also that it would be unavailing to do otherwise. The now is the word for rational animal. So mankind is the only rational animal on Earth, according to classical philosophy. On Mars, there are three kinds, these Sorns, the Hrossa, and the Fifiltrigi. So he's saying it would not be the work of a rational animal to lie. And he says they were astonished at what he had to tell them of human history, of war, slavery, and prostitution. It is because they have no Oyarsa, said one of the pupils. We'll meet the Oyarsa in a bit. It's the angelic leader of a planet. It's called the Oyarsa. It is because every one of them wants to be a little Oyarsa himself, a little god unto himself. They cannot help it, said the old Sorn. There must be rule, yet how can creatures rule themselves? Beasts must be ruled by Hnau, and Hnau by Eldila, which is the angel, the word for angel, and Eldila by Meleldil, the word for God. These creatures have no Eldila. They are like one trying to lift himself by his own hair, or one trying to see over a whole country when he is on a level with it, like a female trying to beget young on herself. Lewis has this idea that because we are the planet where Satan has rebelled against God, and this is why we are called the silent planet. Remember, the book is called Out of the Silent Planet. Our world, which we call Earth, is actually called Fulcundra, which means silent planet because we've been basically siphoned off from the rest of heaven so that Satan won't infect the rest of the world. And we are the only world where there is no natural communion with angels, and there are no archangels to rule us, because Satan is kind of this evil, dark, twisted, or they call him bent archangel. Therefore, we think of all rule as a kind of humiliation. To submit to rule is humiliating. Milton himself knew this well because, of course, he believed in the republic and not so much in the supreme monarchy. He wrote in defense of regicide. And this sense that all rule is a kind of abasement is what Lewis thinks of as the kind of grand error of our fallen world. He says there are ways for things to be superior to one another and inferior to one another that only look like love. So here's from his preface, Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost. He wrote in 1942 a really magnificent treatise on the poem, and he says, every being is a conductor of superior love, or agape, to the being below it, and of inferior love, or eros, to the being above. Such is the loving inequality between the intelligence who guides a sphere and the sphere which is guided. This is not metaphor. For the Renaissance thinker, not less but more than for the schoolman, the universe was packed and tingling with anthropomorphic life. Its true picture is to be found in the elaborate title pages of old folios, where winds blow at the corners and at the bottom dolphins spout, and the eye passes upward through cities and kings and angels to 4 Hebrew letters with rays darting from them at the top, which represent the ineffable name. Hence, We are only on the borderline of metaphor when Spencer's Artegall reproves the leveling giant by telling him that all things were created in goodly measure and do know their certain bound, so that hills do not disdain valleys, nor valleys envy hills, in virtue of the same grand authority who causes kings to command and subjects to obey. This is for Spencer, that is in The Fairy Queen, the poem The Fairy Queen, more than a fanciful analogy. The social hierarchy has the same source as the cosmic, is indeed the impression of the same seal made upon a different kind of wax. Remember the court, right? The courtly poetry of Milton, which imbues the whole heavens with a sort of courtly order, and an order of love, an order of mutual respect. Of course, as humans, we abuse respect and trust and authority all the time. But Lewis is trying to recover the unfallen sense of authority, which ultimately has its root in God, and which is pure joy, even for the lower creature, to worship or adore God and therefore to obey the higher creature, which is also under God and adores God as well. If you are looking for comfy footwear, look no further than Sole. I love their products. I'm particularly enamored of their sandals, but they don't just make sandals. They have all sorts of inserts for your foot and boots and all kinds of things that just make it really comfortable to walk around. A lot of shoes these days you wear, they kind of flatten out. After a while, they feel pretty painful, Sole just fixes all of that, really supports your foot for anything active that you may be doing. I use them for weightlifting, of course. I love for deadlifts to get that, really good positioning on the ground. But, if you're a runner, if you're a golfer, anything that you would do that's active or just for walking around the house, Sole's products really are phenomenal. They're made of cork, which is a really sort of springy but also comfortable material to have at the bottom of your shoe. You can get 50% off everything in their store by going to yoursole, yoursole.com/heretics. That's 50% off, half off everything. 90-day money-back guarantee, so very, very hard to go wrong with this stuff. At yoursole.com/heretics, use the offer code heretics to get 50% off everything at yoursole.com/heretics. Now, as I've been saying throughout, this whole notion that we can rejoice in and learn from the discoveries of science while also understanding them as expressive of some deeper, higher thing, which is God's will, depends upon this concept of mythological truth or storytelling truth. That when I tell you a story, which isn't factually true, but which is metaphorical, I'm telling you a truth that is in some sense more urgent and more essential than if I just tell you the facts. How can I convey to you what it's like to see a sunset? Not by saying, well, there was light refracted through air and certain photons moved in certain ways, but rather by saying there was an explosion of color on the horizon and I felt my heart leap up in my chest like a kind of regal announcement, right? I mean, these poetic ways of talking get at what it is like to be human in a way that no mere physical description can. Even the physical descriptions that describe what happened in our body when we have experiences, when we talk about serotonin or rushes of adrenaline. The only reason those kinds of descriptions work is because we associate them with a certain qualitative experience, and that qualitative experience is everything that matters. What does it matter that something is big or colorful or round unless we're there to see the beauty in it, right? And so this way of conveying things is, for Lewis, a way of conveying a truth that goes beyond meta, the physical, the physique, right? And he draws on in this from this deep well of theory about myth, poetry, and memory. That's the next part I'm going to read. Ransom ends up fleeing from his captors on Malacandra. He thinks that they're trying to bring him to an evil leader or perhaps even sort of weird idol to sacrifice him. So he flees and he runs into these creatures called the Hrossa. A singular is a Hross. They're kind of like giant otter men, but they're the poets of the world. There are three rational animals. So mankind is a rational animal. There are three other kinds of rational animal, or in the old solar language, now, on Malacandra. And the Hrossa are the first. They're the poet race. And he makes friends with them in this kind of, native, going native sort of way. The whole thing is tinged with like the European imperial spirit, right? That there are worlds out there where there are noble savages. But for Lewis, he kind of ennobles it by suggesting that these other worlds contain unfallen creatures who are actually far more virtuous, if simpler than us. So this is this idea that he's gone out, he's become part of this native community of Hrossa, and he makes a particular friend. And here's the conversation between them. Friend's name is Hyoy. So here they are. They worked hard at Hyoi's boat till noon. They're on their way out to a hunt, and then spread themselves on the weed close to the warmth of the creek and began their midday meal. The warlike nature of their preparations suggested many questions to Ransom. He knew no word for war, but he managed to make Hyoi understand what he wanted to know. Ransom asks, did Cerrone and Hrossa and Fifiltrigi ever go out like this, with weapons, against each other? What for? Asked Hyoi. It was difficult to explain. If both wanted one thing, and neither would give it, said Ransom, would the other at last come with force? Would they say, give it or we kill you? Hyoi answers, what sort of thing? Well, food, perhaps. If the other Hnau wanted food, why should we not give it to them? We often do, says the Hrossa, says Hyoi. But how if we had not enough for ourselves? But Maleldil will not stop the plants growing. Maleldil is their word for God, whom they all know and believe in. Hyoi, if you had more and more young, would Maleldil broaden the Handramit and make enough plants for them all? So this is the space where they live, the Handramit, the kind of valley where they live. The Cerrone know that sort of thing. But why should we have more young? Ransom found this difficult. At last he said, is the begetting of young not a pleasure among the Hrossa? A very great one, man. This is what we call love. If a thing is a pleasure, a man wants it again. He might want the pleasure more often than the number of young that could be fed. It took Hyoi a long time to get the point. You mean, he said slowly, that he might do it not only in 1 or 2 years of his life, but again. Yes. But why? Would he want his dinner all day, or want to sleep after he had slept? I do not understand. But dinner comes every day. This love, you say, comes only once while the Hross lives. But it takes his whole life, says Hyoi. When he is young, he has to look for his mate, and then he has to court her. Then he begets young, then he rears them, then he remembers all this, and boils it inside him, and makes it into poems and wisdom. But the pleasure he must be content only to remember. That is like saying, my food I must be content only to eat. I do not understand, says Ransom, and then Hyoi says, a pleasure is full-grown only when it is remembered. You are speaking, man, as if the pleasure were one thing, and the memory another. It is all one thing. The Cerrone could say it better than I say it now. Not better than I could say it in a poem. What you call remembering is the last part of the pleasure, as the krach is the last part of a poem. When you and I met, the meeting was over very shortly. It was nothing. Now it is growing something as we remember it. But still, we know very little about it. What it will be when I remember it as I lie down to die, what it makes in me all my days till then, that is the real meeting. The other is only the beginning of it. You say you have poets in your world. Do they not teach you this? That's one of the most beautiful passages, I think, in all of Lewis's literary output. This idea that all of the folly, or a great part of the folly of our fallen humanity, is the failure to recognize that time is not the coming into being and dying of things, but the traveling along a path. And our memory is where we come to know the true nature of a thing in poetic form. So the example that Hyoi gives is perfect. You meet your best friend, or you meet the love of your life, and you may not even think that much about it at the time, right? Maybe you just meet somebody that you kind of like, you shake hands, or you do whatever you do to greet this person, and then the next day it's over and you don't think about it. And then the circumstances of your life come into being, occur, things happen, you end up, let's say, marrying this person. And then you look back on that moment and it glows with this incredible significance. Even if you didn't feel that significance at the time, there is just this warm sense around it that you really can't get out of your memory. And Hyoi is suggesting that that's the poetic impulse in man telling the real story of our lives, that we reach back through time to see in retrospect, in light of what has happened, the real nature of that event, even if there was no sunrise, for example, in the moment you met the love of your life. You might remember it with this kind of warm sunrise glow, and that's a kind of physical expression, a metaphorical expression, a storytelling expression of what the event really was. Because, of course, from God's perspective, all time is laid out like a book. It doesn't mean we don't make choices, it just means that God observes us making choices from a standpoint outside of time, and the nature of the thing contains within it all that will come after it. And the telling of that is only available to us because we live in time in retrospect, when we look back. The way that we remember events, the stories that we tell about them, the way that we mythologize them, contains as much reality, as much glory and excellence, or maybe even more, than the experience we have in the moment. This is a very deep and old idea. It reaches back in some sense to Plato, who in the Meno and the Phaedo, these dialogues of Plato, he talks about this doctrine of anamnesis, that by learning certain profound essential concepts, like when we see that 1 + 1 = 2, we recognize that in what Kant might have called a kind of a priori way. It's called a synthetic a priori truth, that when we see it, we know it's real and true, even though we've never heard about 1 and 2 before. We see the logic in it. And this is a kind of remembering. It's not just something that we are being told for the first time and have to memorize. It's something that we are recalling. And from this, we get an idea that somewhere in our distant, unrememberable past, perhaps even our pre-birth past, we have a communion with truth that is simple and essential, and toward which we journey away as we become more complex and grow old, but ultimately which we must reconstruct in a conscious way. It's like this subconscious communion with God that we're always trying to come back to in our conscious selves. Augustine picks this up in Book 10 of his Confessions, that God is in our memory, and that's how, in some sense, we recognize that we yearn for him, because how could we yearn for something we had never known? And this poem, when Hioy talks about, don't your poets teach you this, I wonder whether Lewis has in mind here this wonderful ode by Wordsworth, the great Romantic poet. This is his poem, Ode on Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. And it's about this. It's about the fact that, that old Bible verse, right? You must become as little children if you're to enter the kingdom of heaven. That children have this kind of organic, innate connection to the wonder of the world, to the miraculousness of the fact that the sun should rise. Never mind the physics of it. It's still a miracle. It's a kind of beneficence, a blessing. That's how we experience it. Children have this direct, unmediated access to it. And by reaching back into our memory, we find a kind of recollection of more than just the thing that we actually remember. So here's the lines from Wordsworth, which say this, I think, better than I ever could. He writes, "Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home." The reason I think that this is part of what Lewis has in mind is because he mentions Wordsworth in one of his nonfiction discussions of this theme. So remember I said that in these stories and these myths, he's in some ways making you feel truths that he tells you in his speeches and his nonfiction writing. So here's probably my favorite speech Lewis ever gave, The Weight of Glory, a sermon preached in 1942. And here's what Lewis has to say as he's describing to his audience the realities that they yearn for, which are realities, perhaps unbeknownst to them, of God and of heaven. He says, "In speaking of this desire for our own far-off country, which we find in ourselves even now, I feel a certain shyness. I am almost committing an indecency. I am trying to rip open the inconsolable secret in each one of you, the secret which hurts so much that you take your revenge on it by calling it names like nostalgia and romanticism and adolescence, the secret also which pierces with such sweetness that when, in very intimate conversation, the mention of it becomes imminent, we grow awkward and affect to laugh at ourselves, the secret we cannot hide and cannot tell, though we desire to do both. We cannot tell it because it is a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. We cannot hide it because our experience is constantly suggesting it, and we betray ourselves like lovers at the mention of a name. Our commonest expedient is to call it beauty and behave as if that had settled the matter. Wordsworth's expedient was to identify it with certain moments in his own past. But all this is a cheat. If Wordsworth had gone back to those moments in the past, he would not have found the thing itself, but only the reminder of it. What he remembered would turn out to be itself a remembering. The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them, and what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past are good images of what we really desire, but if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. Do you think I am trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am, but remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. It's a brilliant passage, and it gets at the heart of exactly what he's doing in this series of books. In this trilogy, he's basically telling you this story, this fairy tale that gets at the thing that you always yearn for in your past but can never find by going back. You can't go back. You can only go forward out of Eden, as Milton says in Paradise Lost. From paradise they wend their solitary way. This idea that we've been exiled from the place of our longing, the place where we will be at peace, the place where our whole heart longs to be, and to talk about it is to only be able to kind of arouse these yearnings for the past, when really what we're doing is describing our vision of the future. Whenever you go back to your childhood home, of course there's memory, of course there's nostalgia, but it never quite lives up to what you have in mind, because that glow of the memory is in part the essence of what you're experiencing. You're experiencing what was really going on at that time, even unbeknownst to you. And this is one of the things that I've sometimes noticed, that I get nostalgic for the present moment. Like I'll be sitting around my family with the Christmas tree, and I will think, wow, I'm really sad thinking about this being in the past. I don't know if you've ever experienced this yourself, but I know that friends of mine have as well. And that is that awareness that you sometimes snap into of this moment as it lives outside of time, this moment as it grows in your memory, as it takes on the significance in the past that it really has. And this sense of things is in some way, I think, the kind of knowing and the kind of experience that Lewis is trying to reawaken in a world that has come to believe that science and physical knowledge is the only way of knowing stuff. It might be getting too late to buy gifts for Christmas, but you know what it's never too late for? Steak wrapped in bacon. I am talking about Omaha steaks. Their food is delicious. I'm making it for dinner all the time these days. It's not just for the holidays, although it is great for the holidays, and I will be serving it to friends and family this Christmas. But really, anytime that you want a good, hearty meal, Omaha Steaks is the place to go for quality meat. It's not super hard to prepare. It always comes out great. When you go to omahasteaks.com and enter Heretics into the search bar, you can find the perfect gift package. So even if it's too late for Christmas gifts, still birthdays and stuff coming up, or just give yourself a gift, it's $99.99 and you'll get 24 entrees, including bacon-wrapped filet mignon, but also chicken breasts, sides, desserts, and much more. So when you go to omahasteaks.com and enter Heretics into the search bar, you'll get all of that for the incredible price of $99.99, more than half off their usual price, and you'll get an additional 8 Omaha Steaks burgers free with your order. That's 8 free burgers plus all the rest. Really, any time of year, it's perfect. And I'm going to be eating them basically just all the time now. So omahasteaks.com, enter Heretics into the search bar, achieve gifting greatness with Omaha Steaks. Incredible flavor, incredible value, and 100% guaranteed. omahasteaks.com, enter Heretics into the search bar. Into this world of memory and myth and longing and beauty, this world of Malacandra that Lewis has created, there crashes Weston the scientist. And Weston is a kind of amalgam of everything that Lewis considers wrong about it, for him, the new scientific outlook, and what is for us the well-tread, well-acknowledged scientific outlook, which has, in some sense, taken over our public discourse and colonized our minds. It's really hard to think our way out of it, which is in part what I'm trying to do with this episode, right? That we're talking about a set of assumptions that now just lives and breathes in the air, that matter is all there is, that force and life and strength are the highest goods. There's nothing higher than just to go on living and be as strong and fast as possible. And Lewis wrote in a letter that this whole novel was essentially a response to a couple science fiction novels. What immediately spurred me to write was Olaf Stapledon's Last and First Men and an essay in J.B.S. Haldane's Possible Worlds, both of which seemed to take the idea of such space travel seriously and to have the desperately immoral outlook which I try to pillory in Weston. He mentions Lewis also throughout these books that he's indebted to H.G. Wells, although he kind of tries to contest Wells's idea that the universe is full of horrors. And he's answering what was a very popular and remains a very popular idea that if mankind is a rational animal, then the best thing for him to do is leave the animal part behind and just refine his reason until he becomes pure, disembodied mind with total power over the physical world. This is going to become more and more important throughout the series, but he finds in these sort of modern science fiction accounts, especially this Last and First Men, which is just a story about the different ages of men as they grow out of, mere animals into kind of endless evolution, just getting faster, stronger, better, more reasonable, and finally becoming, purely rational beings. He finds in this a kind of amorality or immorality because it makes the best thing that we can be into strong things, exerting strength over nature. And he does this genius thing, which is he brings both Weston and Ransom into the court of the Oyarsa of Malakander, that is the archangel of this planet who rules over everything. And because it's kind of echoing, literature from the British Empire, there's this wonderful feature where Weston and Devine basically think that they're among savages, and they've only picked up like a little tiny bit of Old Solar, the language, and they think they're here to colonize and take over the world and exert their grand scientific strength over the entire planet and just make man ruler of the universe, essentially. But because they can't speak the language, they can only express these ideas in very plain, simple terms, or Ransom has to translate into the kind of direct language of Old Solar, and it reduces their fancy scientific rhetoric to plain, direct terms, which gives you an insight into how Lewis himself must have thought. He was so good at picking apart the logic of things, right? That he was always excellent at reducing, getting past rhetoric and just reducing things to their plain logical terms. And he does that here through this device of the language that Ransom has to translate what Weston wants out of the Oyarsa. So here's a couple passages from that dialogue. So Weston says, "To you I may seem a vulgar robber, but I bear on my shoulders the destiny of the human race. Your tribal life, with its Stone Age weapons and beehive huts, its primitive coracles and elementary social structure, has nothing to compare with our civilization, with our science, medicine and law, our armies, our architecture, our commerce and our transport system, which is rapidly annihilating space and time. Our right to supersede you is the right of the higher over the lower life. Life, half a moment," said Ransom in English. "That's about as much as I can manage at one go." Then, turning to Oyarsa, he began translating as well as he could. The process was difficult, and the result, which he felt to be rather unsatisfactory, was something like this. So here's Ransom's translation into Old Solar of Weston's grand speech. "Among us, Oyarsa, there is a kind of now who will take other now's food and things when they are not looking. He says he is not an ordinary one of that kind. He says what he does now will make very different things happen to those of our people who are not yet born. He says that among you, now of one kindred, all live together, and the Hrasa have spears like those we used a very long time ago, and your huts are small and round, and your boats small and light, and like our old ones, and you have one ruler. He says it is different with us. He says we know much. There is a thing happens in our world when the body of a living creature feels pains and becomes weak, and he says we sometimes know how to stop it. He says we have many bent people, and we kill them or shut them in huts, and that we have people for settling quarrels between the bent now and their huts and mates and things. He says we have many ways for the now of one kind to kill those of another, and some are trained to do it. He says we build big and strong huts of stones and other things like the Pfiffeltriggi, and he says we exchange many things among ourselves and can carry heavy weights very quickly a long way. Because of all this, he says it would not be the act of a bent now if our people killed all your people." So this parody is actually just a reduction of the essence of what Weston is saying. He's saying we have all this big technological power, we can make big houses, and we can kill people, and we can, tell people not to kill people. And so we're going to kill all of you because our claims are the claims of higher life upon lower life, right? It's a critique in some sense of the excesses of empire, but it's also a critique of the kind of pure scientific social Darwinist idea that because everything is physical, the best thing is to have the most power over the physical world. Elsewhere, Lewis repeatedly says that the power of man over nature always turns out to be the power of man to use nature over other men. And that's basically what Weston gets reduced to here. He ends up having a debate with the Oyarsa himself in which he kind of breaks into his broken, sort of primitive old solar. So this is a part that I really love. So the Oyarsa says, "It is well that I have heard you," said Oyarsa, "for though your mind is feebler, your will is less bent than I thought. It is not for yourself that you would do all this." "No," said Weston proudly in Malacandrian, "me die, man live. Yet you know that these creatures would have to be made quite unlike you before they lived on other worlds." "Yes, yes, all new, no one know yet, strange, big." "Then it is not the shape of the body that you love." "No, me no care how they shaped." "One would think then that it is for the mind you care, but that cannot be, or you would love now, wherever you met it. No care for now, care for man. But if it is neither man's mind, which is as the mind of all other now, is not Meleldil, maker of them all, nor his body, which will change, if you care for neither of these, what do you mean by man?" This had to be translated to Weston. When he understood, he replied, "Me care for man, care for our race, which man begets." He had to ask Ransom the words for race and beget. "Strange," said Oyarsa, "you do not love any one of your race. You would have let me kill Ransom. You do not love the mind of your race, nor the body. Any kind of creature will please you if only it is begotten by your kind, as they now are. It seems to me, thick one, that what you really love is no completed creature, but the very seed itself, for that is all that is left." "Tell him," said Weston, when he had been made to understand this, "that I don't pretend to be a metaphysician. I have not come here to chop logic. If he cannot understand, as apparently you can't either, anything so fundamental as man's loyalty to humanity, I can't make him understand it." Finally, as they begin to go deeper, and I'm trying here again not to spoil the whole thing, but they go deeper into Malacandrian history. They have this whole big debate. Finally, when the Oyarsa suggests that death is part of life and that they might accept this, Weston rides the exasperation born of his desire to speak and his ignorance of the language. "Trash! Defeatist trash!" he shouted at Oyarsa in English. Then, drawing himself up to his full height, he added in Malacandrian, "You say your Meleldil let go dead. Other one, bent one, he fight, jump, live, not all talky. Me no care, Meleldil, like bent one better, me on his side." Now, this is magnificent because he's saying I'm on the side of Satan because Satan worships strength and power, right? If you think that all of this is just sort of mere speculation or straw manning, I want to read to you now from a manifesto of what's called Post-Humanism. This is a growing thing among our technologists that because our technology is becoming better, because we can do all these things with virtual reality, but also gene editing, prosthetic limbs, all of this stuff, all of them good in themselves, what we can really do is we can just make us stronger and better and faster and smarter ad infinitum, no matter what else we do to ourselves, even if we become unrecognizable as human beings. And this is an essay called "Why I Want to Be Post-Human When I Grow Up." It's by Nick Bostrom of Oxford University, my old grad school. And he writes, why would we object to becoming post-human? Well, because maybe the human nature would be troubled by that. He says, "One starting point that has had more appeal is the doctrine that a human being is essentially a rational animal, and that the human telos is the development and exercise of our rational faculties. Views of this sort have distinguished pedigree that can be traced back at least to Aristotle. Whatever the merits of this view, however, it is plainly not a promising objection to the claims I advance in this paper, since it would be perfectly possible for a post-human to realize a telos of rationality as well as a human being could. In fact, if what is good for us is to develop and exercise our rational nature, this implies that it would be good for us to become post-humans with appropriately enhanced cognitive capacities, and preferably with extended health span too, so that we may have more time to develop and enjoy these rational faculties." He's saying, man is a rational animal. The best part of us is our reason. So what we should do is increase our capacity for reason and our length of life and our strength beyond anything that would make us now recognizable. This is not an uncommon thing to think. Even Aristotle at points suggests that the life of pure contemplation is the highest, best thing of which humanity is capable. But it certainly does, by definition, unmake us as human beings. If mankind is a rational animal, then we are both rational and animal, and our exertion of our reason in the human sphere, the sphere of courage and love and desire, where there are limits upon us, where we are embodied souls, that is what we are. And there is such a thing as being good at that kind of being, and it's called virtue. We've talked about this before, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Virtue is being good at being human. It means embodying eternal principles in the here and now, in the flesh, much as in an incarnation. Virtue is a word you will not find anywhere used in those terms in Bostrom's paper, because he does not recognize it as one of the concerns about whether we should totally distort and transform and transcend our humanity. In fact, at one point he says, I'm only talking about whether it would be good for you to become post-human, not whether it would be morally right. If you have moral objections, that's not what I'm talking about. Well, I'm sorry, but if you have moral objections, then perhaps we should decide whether those moral objections obtain or not. And all I can tell you is that our current steps in the direction of post-humanism, for example, are radical experimentations with transgenderism, pumping kids full of hormones because they believe that there's some cognitive innate spirit, Gnostic spirit in them that is automatically female when their body is male, don't actually seem to me to be moral or good or causing us to be better. In fact, they seem to be leading to all sorts of physical complications and difficulties. And the premise here seems to be, well, we've only gone a little bit in this direction. And yeah, it's making us miserable and sick and ugly and ill. But if we go infinitely in this direction, then everything will be great and perfect and utopian. And that just doesn't seem like a good sell to me. So once again, if you reduce this stuff down to kind of old solar language, so just the basic premise here is strength and speed and smartness and long life are the highest goods, and we must maximize them at the expense of our humanity. That's not a sell for me. And it remains the sell of our technological class, this post-humanist sell, this transhuman ideal that you will own nothing and be happy and you'll eventually be abstracted up into the cloud or the metaverse or whatever and be able to just make reality whatever you want it to be. None of that is working now. So why is it going to work if we do it at an infinite remove? This, to me, is what Lewis saw already in this story. And he's effectively working in a mythological way toward what it means to be incarnate, to be a soul in a body, to be form in matter. If we lose that, if we take it away, no matter what else we gain, none of it will matter, because all the essence, all the qualia, all the good, the beauty will be lost upon creatures who are simply minds operating an infinitely malleable physical universe. That doesn't sound very nice to me. And I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's just something that we have to do because the technology exists to do it. When you put it in simple terms like that, as Lewis teaches us to do, I prefer to stay human. If you want to know more about this, by the way, you should read my colleague James Poulos' book, Human Forever. That's all I have time for today. We'll do more Space Trilogy with Paralandra Part 2 next week. You guys, there is no doubt about the fact that our higher education system is broken. If you're listening to this show, you probably don't need me to say that. But what you might not know is that the Albertus Magnus Institute is the solution to this problem. They are here to fix it and to ransom the captives of a broken education system. Their namesake, Albert the Great, was known for his treatise on the highest good, and that is what they study, the grand traditions of the West and the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. So everybody listening to my voice right now would benefit from being a Magnus Fellow. The Magnus Fellowship is free. It's always free. And it's an enormous, fully online, interactive, virtual, tuition-free set of courses that rigorously pursue wisdom and many of the values that we discuss on this very show. You can join a group of people committed to pursuing lifelong education and become a Magnus Fellow today at magnusinstitute.org/heretics. There is really no better place to go if you want to deepen and broaden your education. Of course, we can only talk about so much for 1 hour a week. And so becoming a Magnus Fellow is a phenomenal way to take that education forward. One more time, it's magnusinstitute.org/heretics. And when you use that special link, you will get a free gift upon applying. So make sure you type in magnusinstitute.org/heretics and check out the Albertus Magnus Institute. All right, let's do the mailbag. Mailbag questions come to me through Locals. VIPs on Locals have exclusive access to all sorts of extra Young Heretics content. This is a community of people outside the reach of big tech, an incredibly special and valuable community to me, as I discuss with you what the show is making you feel and think about, how you're putting things in action into your real life. I write exclusive essays on there. I give tips on the best whiskey to drink and the best cigars to smoke. But above all, it's really just a way for us to take the themes of the show deeper and indeed even get to know one another better. If you want to become a VIP, I really hope you'll join us. And now is a perfect time because we're running a Christmas special. All in the lead up to Christmas, you can get an annual VIP membership for just $40. It's usually $56 until Christmas. It's $40 only to join as an annual member at youngheretics.com/VIP. locals. And immediately upon the coming of December 26th, I will morph back into the Grinch that I usually am, which means that it will be back up to $56. And so you better get it now. Also, I'm running a Young Heretics Advent calendar that you can only get on Locals as a VIP. I translate a little bit of the Bible every day, and we talk about what it means. Really, I think a special feature. So come join us, youngheretics.com/locals. Okay, here's a mailbag question from Tyler. It seems audiences of today's art enjoy individual characters so much to where some root for the immoral antagonists to win. However, without an overarching story to give characters purpose, I feel like I'm watching people wander around in a void. What are your thoughts on developmental balance between characters and story? Do the characters make the story, or do the story make the characters? Well, this is a complex and old and ancient question, of course. And I agree with you, Tyler, that I'm getting a little bit sick of the bad boy or the anti-hero trope, and I think it's kind of falling out of fashion. It sort of comes into being with like shows like The Sopranos and The Wire and Peak TV, and there's Breaking Bad is another one. But in its older kind of American form, we talked about it when we talked about the Maltese Falcon. If you remember, I did this whole thing on the bad boy, or the the sort of dark knight who wanders out into the streets. And he has to be rough, he has to be aggressive, he has to be manly, but ultimately he's working for the greater good. So I think what we are grappling with in all these bad boy stories, which is now kind of morphing into the like good guy trope. We've got that. I haven't seen it, but they've got that show on Apple Plus, Ted Lasso. All of this is wrestling with what it means to be a good man, which would have been a question that fathers could answer for their sons like that back in the day. This was something that people talked about all the time. And what we've been acknowledging about manhood in various ways is that there's some raw energy to it that's aggression. And, radical 12th wave feminists or whatever want to cancel out that aggression. They think it makes all men into boors. But other saner people will respond, no, it's just the kind of raw material of manhood that can be shaped for good or ill. And when it's shaped for good, it's actually the driving creative force of society. And so what a show like Breaking Bad is wrestling with is a real moral question, which is this courage that he shows when he kind of takes his life into his own hands is in itself kind of admirable, even though he does terrible things with it. Even though what he does is become a meth dealer and a terrible human being, we kind of admire him for taking up his manly burden and asserting himself. And so it's coming to grips with this old truth that we've talked about a lot on the show, that courage is a sort of morally neutral moral virtue. It's the thing that enables other virtues. You can't be generous or prudent or kind or generous unless you're kind and generous in risky situations under duress. But courage itself can be applied and admirably applied to terrible, ugly, hideous things. This is something that we know about manhood, that it has a kind of raw material, raw energy that we can only fully praise when it's directed in the right way. And so I do agree with you that we're stumbling around in the dark. But I think what we're stumbling around is this idea of masculinity that we've totally deconstructed, totally devalued, totally mocked in the public square, called toxic, called all sorts of nasty names. And it remains to be seen whether we will develop that larger moral context within which we can see a man be tough, be strong, be courageous, and also use all of those things for good rather than evil. You know what's the best depiction of this that I've seen recently is in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that Quentin Tarantino movie. The character is played by Brad Pitt, who's kind of this like roadie. Like he's not the movie star, but he's got this young girl in his car, and she basically offers to give him a blowjob. She offers to hook up with him, and he lets her out of the car. And suddenly we see the immense strength it took not to sleep with this vulnerable young girl. That's manhood, right? That's the fact of his big appetites, his grand desires, his enormous virility is the context within which we admire that he's put a check on it, that he's, in this instance, exercised what the Greeks would call sophrosune, which is moderation or self-restraint. Another great Greek set of words here is enkrateia, which means power over yourself, and its opposite, which is akrasia, or incontinence, or the sort of lack of self-control. And I think a lot of what we're dealing with is the necessity of enkrateia to shape the raw material of manhood into virtue. And then we'll be really talking finally again about those old truths that need telling in every civilization. But for now, we've kind of lost our way on it a bit. I agree. All right. Thanks for that question, Tyler. I'll see you on Locals. One more time, it's youngheretics.com/locals. Only $40 for the month of December until the 25th to become an annual VIP. That's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Looking forward to more Lewis next week. If you like this show, you will love the work that we do at the Claremont Institute. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind, both, I think, rich with fascinating opinions and arguments and scholarship. You can also donate to support our work in defense of the American idea at claremont.org/donate. And if you do that, please do let us know in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics, because it's great to know that all of our projects are in harmony and alignment. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.